The role and the duties of monarchy also remain, as does the sovereign's particular relationship and responsibility towards the Church of England.
At 75, King Charles finally broke a silence that had weighed on the throne for decades. Standing beneath the glittering lights of Buckingham Palace, his voice trembled as he whispered, "It is time the world knows the truth." For years, whispers of a hidden royal secret swirled through corridors of power, but no one dared to speak. Now, with the world watching and the monarchy's future on edge, Charles has opened a door that can never be closed. What he revealed has shaken the crown and left Britain breathless for what comes next. The night the king could no longer hide. The wind howled across the rugged Scottish hills, carrying with it the icy bite of a winter evening. Balmoral Castle stood silent against the cold, its ancient stones glowing faintly in the fading light. Inside, a fire burned low in the private study of King Charles, throwing restless shadows against the heavy walls. The flames danced and cracked, but the warmth barely touched him. He sat alone at a grand oak desk, his shoulders bent, his eyes locked on two objects that seemed to hold the weight of his entire life: an old leather-bound journal and a sealed envelope marked with the royal crest. The room around him whispered of power and history, yet he felt none of it. Gold-framed portraits stared from the walls, silent witnesses to generations of kings and queens who had carried their burdens. A black canvas broken only by a thin silver moon. Charles barely noticed. His thoughts were darker than the winter sky. He reached out, running his fingers across the journal's cracked surface. The leather felt soft and worn, like a memory too long kept. Next to it lay the envelope, its seal unbroken, its edges sharp and accusing. He had seen it countless times over the years, but tonight it seemed to burn with an urgency he could no longer ignore. The king had turned 75 only weeks earlier, a milestone that should have been celebrated with joy. Yet the passing of time had brought no peace. The older he grew, the louder the silence became. For decades he had carried a secret that refused to fade. Duty demanded silence. Tradition demanded strength, but the truth, heavy and unyielding, demanded something else entirely. Charles leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. Memories rose like ghosts, uninvited and relentless. He could almost hear the soft echo of footsteps from long ago, the quiet murmur of voices hidden behind thick palace doors. As a boy, he had often wandered the endless halls of Buckingham Palace, searching for warmth in a world built on ceremony. Behind the polished smiles and careful schedules, he sensed something unspoken. He remembered the late nights when arguments drifted through the corridors like smoke, words muffled yet sharp enough to sting. There were names whispered in haste, promises made and broken in the dark, and always there was his mother's face, Queen Elizabeth's calm mask that sometimes cracked when she thought no one was watching. A flicker of worry in her eyes, a pause before certain subjects. As he grew older, the pieces began to take shape, though no one ever confirmed them. Duty closed every door before the truth could step through. Still, the feeling never left him. The secret was not just a story hidden in family history. It was a shadow that followed him into every room, every decision, every quiet moment when the world was not watching. Now, as the King of the United Kingdom, Charles felt the weight more than ever. The crown demanded strength, but the heart demanded honesty. His recent birthday had brought a cruel clarity. Time was no longer on his side. The years ahead would be fewer than the years behind. The secret, if left unsaid, might die with him, and perhaps that had been the plan all along. But tonight, as the fire burned low and the wind battered the castle walls, something inside him shifted. He opened his eyes and stared once more at the envelope. The royal crest gleamed faintly in the firelight, a reminder of the family he had sworn to protect. He thought of Camilla, whose quiet support had steadied him through storms both public and private. He thought of William and Harry, his sons, each carrying their scars from a life lived under relentless scrutiny. They deserved more than silence. The country deserved more. Charles rose from his chair and began to pace, his footsteps echoing across the polished floor. Every movement carried the weight of years of hesitation. He paused by the window and looked out into the dark. Snow threatened in the distant clouds, a storm waiting for the right moment to break. His reflection stared back at him, lined, tired, yet determined. He whispered to the empty room, his voice barely more than a breath. "It's time." but tonight the fear felt smaller than the need for truth. The envelope on the desk seemed to pulse with meaning, a silent challenge he could no longer resist. He turned away from the window and returned to the desk. His hand hovered over the envelope, trembling slightly. The wax seal gleamed, unbroken through decades of secrecy. He thought of the conversations he had overheard as a child, the late-night arguments that had never been explained. He thought of the Queen's eyes when she avoided certain questions. Each memory was a thread, and together they formed a knot that had tightened around his life. Charles sank back into his chair and rested his palm on the envelope. The firelight flickered across his face, revealing a man caught between duty and desire, between the weight of 1,000 years of monarchy and the simple need to breathe freely. He imagined the voices of his ancestors, some urging silence, others whispering courage. The silent lessons of a young prince. The echoes of childhood never truly leave a man, and for Charles those echoes were as cold and measured as the marble halls of Buckingham Palace, a world where every step was planned and every word weighed. As a boy, he learned early that silence was safer than questions, and that love inside a palace could feel as distant as the stars. The grand corridors of Buckingham were magnificent to visitors, but to a young prince, they could feel endless and lonely. High ceilings swallowed sound, and the heavy drapes muffled the laughter of the outside world. Charles moved through those halls like a small shadow, his footsteps barely heard over the ticking of ancient clocks. Each day followed a strict schedule, lessons with tutors, carefully timed meals, perfectly rehearsed appearances. There was little space for the simple chaos of a child's heart. His parents, admired by millions, carried their roles with grace, but grace often left little room for tenderness. The Queen was a figure of duty, precise and calm, her every action a reflection of the crown. His father, strong and commanding, demanded discipline more than comfort. Charles loved them both, but he often felt the warmth of their affection hidden behind layers of expectation. There were hugs, yes, but brief and formal. Gestures meant more for reassurance than true closeness. He listened to the soft creak of wooden floors and the far-off sound of conversations carried through the long corridors. Sometimes he pressed his ear against closed doors, catching fragments of words he was never meant to hear, names he did not recognize, phrases like "the future of the crown" or "a decision that must remain." Each whisper lingered in his young mind like a riddle without an answer. He remembered one night in particular, a memory so sharp it never faded. He had woken from a restless sleep and padded quietly down the hall, drawn by the sound of voices. Behind a heavy door, his parents were speaking in low, urgent tones. He heard his father's voice first, deep and steady, followed by the softer, careful reply of his mother. There was a pause, then a name spoken, a name Charles did not know. The room fell silent after it, a silence that carried more weight than any argument. Charles pressed closer, his heart thudding in his chest. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint crackle of a fire inside. Then came his mother's voice, quiet but firm. "It must remain as it is, for the sake of the crown." The words were simple, but to a child they felt heavy, like a locked door he could never open. He stepped back, his small hands trembling. He knew he had heard something important, something too important for a boy to understand. From that night on, he carried the memory like a secret stone in his pocket, silent but impossible to forget. As he grew older, the palace taught him to hide his questions. Lessons in history and statecraft filled his days, but none of them explained the tension he sometimes saw in his mother's eyes. Queen Elizabeth carried her role with the poise of a monarch, yet Charles noticed the fleeting moments when her gaze drifted toward a past she would not speak of. At dinners, during quiet walks in the garden, there were rare seconds when she seemed far away, as if holding back words that belonged only to her. Sometimes, when they sat together in the drawing room after a long day of public duty, Charles would try to catch her expression. She would smile at him, gentle and reassuring, but behind the smile he sensed an ache, a burden hidden beneath the polished surface. He wanted to ask, to reach for the truth that hovered in the air, but he never did. The unspoken rule of royal life was clear. Questions that touched the heart of the crown were questions that must remain unasked. Years passed, and boyhood faded into the duties of a young man. But inside, the old unease remained. He had inherited not just a title, but a weight he could not name. During his years as heir, he began to understand that being next in line was not merely about ceremonies and service. It was about protection. It was about guarding something fragile and powerful, something that could break if exposed. The whispers from his childhood returned in new forms: private meetings where voices lowered when he entered, documents sealed and stored away, conversations that ended abruptly when his presence was known. He remembered a winter evening when his mother called him to a quiet corner of the palace. The air smelled faintly of smoke from the fireplaces, and the heavy curtains muffled the sounds of the outside world. She spoke softly, her words careful but unyielding. "There are things you will carry, Charles," she said, her eyes steady on his, "things that must never be spoken, not for our sake, but for the crown." He nodded, though he did not fully understand. Even then, he sensed that the secret was not a single fact, but a shadow, something larger, older, and more dangerous than he could yet grasp. As the years went on, the shadow shaped him. It made him cautious where others were bold, thoughtful where others were carefree. He learned to smile for cameras while guarding the deepest parts of his heart. He became a man of duty, yet inside he wrestled with questions that had no answers. What had his parents hidden that night behind the heavy door? Whose name had silenced the room? And why did the future of the crown feel like a path paved with silence? The love he could never fully hold. The quiet of the evening wrapped around Charles like a heavy cloak as he sat alone in his private chamber. The glow of a single lamp cast long shadows across the polished floor, and the stillness of the room mirrored the silence he had carried for most of his life. Love had touched his heart, but never without a shadow. The secret he guarded had shaped every choice, every vow, every glance. He thought first of Camilla. From the beginning, she had been the one who understood him without effort. Their laughter had come easily, their conversations flowing late into the night. With her, he felt something rare, a sense of belonging that no title could offer. But even in those early days, when youth still softened the edges of duty, the secret loomed. It stood between them like an invisible wall, reminding him of the limits of their happiness. He loved her, yet every step forward came with the sharp memory of what could never be said. Choices were made not from the freedom of love, but from the careful caution of a man bound by something larger than his heart. Then there was Diana. The world had celebrated their wedding as a fairy tale, a story of a prince and a shining young bride. Crowds cheered, bells rang, and cameras flashed as they walked down the aisle. But behind the smiles and the music, Charles carried the same silent storm. The marriage was not born of pure devotion, and he knew it. It was shaped by expectation, by the needs of a monarchy that demanded appearances over emotions. He had wanted to believe that love could grow from duty, but the secret within him made honesty impossible. He remembered nights when Diana's eyes searched for answers he could not give. There were moments when he almost broke, moments when he wanted to take her hand and whisper the truth that haunted him. During their most painful arguments, when words cut and silence hurt even more, the truth was a door he dared not open. One admission could shatter the life they had built and bring chaos to a family that lived under the watchful gaze of an entire world. One evening stood out in his memory, sharper than the rest. It was late, the palace quiet, when his mother called him to her private sitting room. Queen Elizabeth sat by the window, her posture composed as always, but her eyes carried a heaviness he recognized from childhood. She gestured for him to sit. The fire crackled softly, filling the silence between them. At last, she spoke, her voice calm, yet unyielding. "There are things that must remain unsaid," she told him. "The stability of the monarchy depends on what we choose to keep within these walls." Her words settled over him like a cold mist. She did not name the secret. They never did, but the meaning was clear. His life was not his. His happiness, his love, even his marriage were bound to a duty that demanded silence. He nodded, because there was nothing else to do. The Queen's warning was not just a command. It was a reminder of the invisible chain that tied them all to the crown. From that night on, the line between public image and private reality grew sharper. The world saw a prince who smiled at ceremonies, who waved to cheering crowds, who stood beside his wife and later his children with the perfect posture of a future king. Newspapers printed photographs of family holidays and royal galas, painting a picture of harmony. But inside, Charles lived with a storm that never calmed. Every handshake, every speech, every carefully staged photograph carried the same thought: what if the truth is discovered? At grand state dinners, he wore the mask of a dutiful royal, even as his mind wandered to the fragile letter hidden deep within the royal archives. It was an old letter, written in a graceful hand he knew well, his grandmother, the Queen Mother. He had seen it only once, years ago, when he was still young enough to hope that secrets might fade with time. The letter was short, but the words had burned themselves into his memory. They spoke of decisions made long ago, of promises kept in silence, of a truth so dangerous it could never be spoken. That letter was more than a document. It was a warning, a weight, and a wound. He sometimes wondered if his grandmother had meant for him to find it, or if it had simply survived by chance. Either way, it sat there still, a silent witness to a past that shaped every present moment. He imagined the letter waiting in the quiet of the archives, its paper yellowed, but its meaning sharp, ready to cut through the careful life he had built. Camilla understood more than most. Over the years, she became his refuge, the one person who sensed the unspoken truth even without words. Their love survived not because it was easy, but because she accepted the silence he carried. Still, he knew the secret had cost them years they might have shared freely. Choices made out of fear had kept them apart when their hearts longed to be together. Diana's memory remained a softer ache. He thought of her laughter, her kindness, the way she brought warmth into rooms that had long felt cold. Their marriage had ended in heartbreak, and the world would never fully understand why. He carried his share of that pain, knowing that the silence he maintained had built walls between them that neither could climb. There were nights when he wished he had found the courage to tell her everything, to let her share the burden that had weighed on him since childhood. But he never had, and now the chance was gone. The years rolled on, carrying him through celebrations, losses, and the slow march of time. The public saw a man who fulfilled his duty, who smiled at coronations and christenings, who stood with steady grace as history unfolded around him. Yet inside he remained the boy who once pressed his ear to a palace door and heard a name that silenced a room. The secret lived on, shaping every decision, every love, every goodbye. The night the truth refused to sleep. The day began like any other in the quiet heart of London, but by nightfall, a single discovery threatened to shake the walls of the monarchy. Far from the cameras and grand balconies, a journalist worked alone in a room filled with dust and silence. She was a royal biographer, known for her patience and her unyielding search for facts. Among stacks of yellowed papers and brittle letters, her hand paused on a folder half hidden at the back of a shelf. The folder was thin, its corners bent with age, but a faded royal crest marked it with a quiet power. Inside lay a document few had ever seen. Its ink had faded, but the words were sharp enough to pierce through decades of silence. The paper spoke of an arrangement buried deep in the past, a hidden royal decision meant to remain secret for generations. By morning, whispers spread across newsrooms and into the corridors of power. Rumors surfaced of a hidden royal arrangement, an agreement that could change the story of the crown itself. Headlines hinted at it, reporters exchanged cautious messages, and television anchors wore the tense smiles of people holding back more than they could say. The palace, as always, said nothing. At Clarence's house, the quiet began to feel heavy. Camilla noticed it first. Her husband moved through the day with a restlessness she had seen only a few times before, moments when his thoughts were too loud to hide. His steps were quick but aimless, his eyes distant even when she spoke. At dinner, he barely touched his plate, his mind clearly elsewhere. "Something is troubling you," she said softly, watching him stare at the untouched food. Charles looked up, forcing a thin smile. "It's nothing," he replied, but his voice betrayed him. Camilla did not press, but the concern in her eyes followed him long after the conversation ended. She knew the look of a man haunted by more than a passing worry. This was the face of a king weighed down by a truth only he could carry. Across the city, Prince William sensed it too. This time the storm felt different. William called his brother. "Have you noticed anything?" he asked when Harry's face appeared on the screen. Harry nodded. "He's distant, more than usual. What's going on?" "I do not know," William said, his brow furrowing. "But something's coming. I can feel it." 2 nights later, William decided to confront his father. The palace halls were quiet when he found Charles alone in his study, the fire casting soft light on the polished wood. The king sat with his back straight, but his eyes lowered. A man deep inside thoughts he could not escape. William hesitated in the doorway before stepping inside. "Father," he said, his voice careful, "is there something we should know? Something the world deserves to know?" Charles looked up sharply, the question striking like a sudden wind. For a long moment he said nothing. His eyes, tired and shadowed, held the weight of years. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "There are matters," he said, choosing each word with care, "that have waited longer than they should. Matters that cannot wait much longer." William said nothing more. He simply nodded, sensing that this was not the night for answers. He left the study in silence, but the question hung in the air like a bell that had been struck and left to echo. When the door closed, Charles remained alone with his thoughts. The fire crackled softly, but the warmth did not reach him. He thought of the journalist's discovery, the document buried for decades. He pictured the headlines, the endless analysis, the sharp questions he would not be able to avoid. For years, he had convinced himself that silence protected the monarchy, that time would bury the truth deeper than any vault. But now, the past was moving faster than the crown. He imagined the weight of the secret falling not on him but on his sons. William, careful and steady. Harry, bold and restless. Both would inherit not just a history, but the burden of words never spoken. He had carried the shadow all his life. He could not allow them to carry it next. Outside the window, the night stretched wide and silent. London slept, but inside the king's study, time refused to move. Charles rose from his chair and began to pace, the sound of his footsteps sharp in the stillness. The decision he had avoided for decades now stood before him, clear and immovable. He paused at the desk and laid his hand on a sheet of crisp white paper. And her quiet warning so many years ago, "The stability of the monarchy depends on what remains unsaid." Those words had guided his every step, but tonight they felt less like guidance and more like a chain. He whispered into the empty room, his voice barely above a breath. "It's time." The sound startled him. It was the same phrase he had spoken to himself on other nights, but this time it held a different weight. Tonight it was not a thought, it was a decision. He sat down and picked up the pen. The first stroke of ink on the page felt heavier than any crown. Slowly, carefully, he began to write. His hand trembled, but his resolve did not. Each word carried the weight of years, years of silence, years of sacrifice, years of love and fear intertwined. He did not write for himself. He wrote for his sons, for the family that would live with the consequences, and for a country that deserved the truth. Outside, the moonlight spilled across the palace gardens, pale and cold. Inside, the king wrote through the night, pausing only to gather thoughts that refused to stay quiet. The world still slept, unaware that a page was turning in history. Hours passed. The fire burned low, leaving only the soft glow of embers. When he finally set the pen down, the statement lay before him, simple and unadorned. It was not just an admission, it was a release. Charles leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. The silence in the room felt different now, lighter, though the storm ahead would surely be fierce. He knew the morning would bring questions, judgment, and headlines, but it would also bring freedom, not for him alone, but for the sons who would follow. The night the crown spoke the truth. The palace was silent, but the world was wide awake. Across continents, television screens flickered to life. In bustling cities, in quiet towns, and in the smallest living rooms, millions of people sat waiting, their eyes fixed on one image. A royal chamber lit with a soft golden glow, a single chair placed before a table of polished wood, and a man who carried the weight of centuries on his shoulders. King Charles sat perfectly still, his back straight. A single lamp burned beside him, casting a warm circle of light that caught the faint silver strands in his hair. It was not the setting of a grand speech, it was a place for confession. When he finally looked up at the camera, the world saw a man who had known both privilege and pain. His face carried the lines of a life lived under endless scrutiny, but tonight the weariness was sharper. He drew a slow breath, and when he began to speak, his voice trembled like a candle flame in the wind. "My dear people," he began, his words soft but steady. "Tonight I must share a truth long buried for the sake of duty, a truth I have carried alone for many years." The silence that followed seemed to stretch across oceans. Viewers leaned closer to their screens. Journalists held their breath, pens frozen above notebooks, Even those who had never cared for royal affairs felt the pull of something larger than gossip. This was not a ceremony. This was a reckoning. Charles continued, each word heavy with the weight of decades. When I was a young man, a decision was made within these walls, a decision meant to protect the stability of the monarchy. But that decision has haunted every day of my life. Tonight, I can no longer remain silent. I must tell you what was hidden from you, and from me, for far too long. His hands tightened slightly on the table. The camera caught the small movement, a reminder that even a king could feel fear. He looked down for a moment, gathering strength, then lifted his eyes again. "It concerns my lineage," he said, his voice quieter now, each syllable deliberate. "There was a time when the truth of my birth was questioned, and arrangements were made to protect the crown. Records were sealed, stories were rewritten. What I believed to be my beginning was not the full story. A part of my life, my very identity, was hidden to preserve the line of succession." The words landed like thunder. Around the world, gasps filled living rooms. Social media lit up with frantic messages. Was he admitting to a hidden adoption, a concealed parentage, a choice that changed history? He did not offer the fine details, but he did not need to. The meaning was clear enough to shake even the strongest believers in royal perfection. Charles pressed on, his voice steadier now, as if the telling itself gave him strength. This truth was buried to protect the crown, but in doing so it has left a shadow over my life. I have lived each day knowing there was something unsaid. I have smiled at celebrations, stood before nations, and sworn oaths while carrying a secret that was never truly mine to keep. Duty demanded silence, but silence has a cost, and tonight I can no longer ask the future to bear the burden of the past. He paused, his eyes glistening. I have loved this country, and I have served it with all that I am. But I am also a man, a son, a father, and a man cannot live fully while hiding the truth of his beginning. The camera held him in a close frame, every breath audible, every flicker of emotion visible. There was no script to soften the blow, no grand gesture to distract the eye, only a man and his confession. Beyond the chamber walls, the reaction was instant. Newsrooms erupted, phones rang with frantic urgency. In homes across Britain and beyond, people exchanged stunned looks. Some felt betrayed, others compassionate. Some whispered of scandal, others spoke of courage. But in every heart, there was the undeniable sense that history was being rewritten before their eyes. Inside the palace, the family listened. Behind the cameras, William and Harry stood side by side, their faces pale but steady, his eyes fixed on his father. Harry crossed his arms, his face unreadable but his presence unwavering. Charles took another deep breath. "I reveal this not to wound, but to heal," he said. "The monarchy has survived wars, trials, and change because it adapts. Tonight, adaptation means honesty. I cannot ask my sons to carry a shadow I was too afraid to confront. The cost to my soul has been unbearable. The cost to my family is even greater." As he spoke, a soft rustle of movement drew the camera's attention. Camilla entered the frame, her steps quiet but sure. She wore a simple dark dress, her expression tender and calm. Without a word, she placed her hand gently on Charles's. He turned slightly toward her, a flicker of relief in his tired eyes. For a brief moment, the image of the king and queen consort sitting side by side told a story beyond words. Their joined hands spoke of years of private struggle, of love that had weathered every storm. Camilla looked at him, then at the camera, her silence an anchor in the emotional tide. Charles continued, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. "I have been blessed beyond measure, but tonight I stand before you not as a symbol, but as a man seeking truth. Whatever judgment comes, I accept it. My only wish is that the truth will free the generations to come, so that they may serve without the shadows that have followed me." The chamber seemed to grow even quieter. The faint sound of the clock on the mantel was the only noise that dared to break the stillness. Charles glanced down at his hands, then back to the camera. "This is not the end of our story," he said, his eyes shining with both sorrow and resolve. "It is the beginning of an honest one. My heart is heavy, but tonight it is also free." He closed his statement with a slow nod, his gaze holding the lens for a long, unbroken moment. Then, with quiet dignity, he placed his hand over Camilla's and whispered, barely audible, "Thank you." The screen faded to black. Across the world, people sat frozen, the silence of their rooms echoing the silence of the royal chamber. Some wept, some reached for their phones, some simply stared at the blank screen, knowing they had witnessed something no history book had prepared them for. The dawn after the storm. The night after King Charles's confession was unlike any other in modern royal history. London, usually so familiar and orderly, had transformed into a city alive with emotion. Outside the gates of Buckingham Palace, crowds gathered beneath the silver glow of streetlights and the soft haze of early morning mist. Some came with tears streaming down their faces. Others raised flags or held handwritten signs of love and support. A few stood in silent disbelief, their eyes fixed on the towering palace as though waiting for it to speak again. Across the world, the story was everywhere. Newspapers printed bold headlines that seemed almost too extraordinary to believe. The king speaks the truth. Charles breaks centuries of silence. Every front page carried his face, tired, honest, and unguarded. On television, anchors spoke with a mix of shock and admiration. Social media pulsed with messages of sympathy and debate. Some praised his courage, others questioned the monarchy itself, but no one could deny it. The king's revelation had changed everything. He finally told them, a man murmured. After all these years, he finally told the world. A grandmother in a long coat wiped her eyes and said softly, "It took a lifetime, but he did it." Their voices carried through the cold air like a chorus of quiet awe. Inside the palace, the mood was different, but no less charged. The grand corridors, lined with portraits of kings and queens who had ruled in silence, now echoed with a strange stillness. The truth had been spoken, and in that truth there was both relief and uncertainty. King Charles stood by a tall window in his private study, the same room where he had made his historic address. The fire that had burned so brightly the night before was now only a soft bed of glowing embers. He rested his hand on the windowsill, gazing out at the crowds gathered beyond the gates. For the first time in decades, he felt a quiet calm rising within him. "It's lighter," he whispered to himself, his breath fogging the cold glass. He had feared this moment for so long, imagining chaos, anger, and rejection. Instead, he felt a strange peace, a freedom he had not known since childhood. The burden of secrecy, carried through years of duty and sacrifice, had finally been set down. Camilla entered the room silently, her footsteps soft against the polished floor. She stood beside him, her presence steady and warm. "They're still out there," she said gently, glancing toward the crowd. "They're waiting for you to step out, even if only for a wave." Charles smiled faintly but did not move from the window. "Let them wait," he replied. "Tonight is not about the ceremony. It's about breathing again." Later that morning, as dawn stretched pale light across the city, Charles met privately with his sons. The conversation was simple, but its weight was immeasurable. William entered first, his posture firm, but his eyes soft with understanding. Harry followed, quieter, his expression unreadable yet open. For a moment they stood together in silence, three men who had weathered years of public judgment, now joined by a single truth. William was the first to speak. "Father," he said, his voice low, "you did what we all feared, but you did it with courage. You've given us something we never had before." Charles looked at his eldest son, his eyes glistening. "And what is that, William?" "Freedom," William answered simply. "You've given us the chance to lead without shadows." Harry stepped closer, his voice softer but no less certain. "You've shown us that honesty is strength, not weakness. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Charles reached out, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. In that quiet room, surrounded by the echoes of centuries, a new bond formed, not of duty alone, but of shared truth. For years, silence had kept them apart. Now, openness began to heal what secrecy had wounded. That afternoon, Charles addressed the public once more, not with a grand speech, but with a heartfelt message delivered through the palace gates. Standing before a small gathering of reporters and citizens, he spoke of the path ahead. "The monarchy endures," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "But it must endure not because of silence, but because of honesty. Our strength is not in hiding the past, but in embracing it. I hope that the truth I shared will guide us toward a future where trust is our greatest tradition." The crowd listened in respectful stillness. Some nodded, some wept, and others simply held their breath, feeling the shift in the air. When Charles finished, a quiet cheer rose. The room welcomed him with the soft crackle of a newly lit fire and the faint scent of old leather and wood. On his desk lay the envelope, the same sealed envelope that had haunted him for years. Its royal crest still gleamed faintly in the firelight, but its power was gone. He picked it up, feeling the familiar weight between his fingers. For so long it had been a symbol of fear, a reminder of the secret he once believed he must carry to his grave. Now it was nothing more than paper. Slowly, deliberately, he opened the drawer of his desk and placed the envelope inside. "It's done," he whispered, his voice barely breaking the quiet. The words carried no triumph, only peace. Outside the window, the first light of morning began to spill over the palace grounds. The sky shifted from deep blue to soft pink, the promise of a new day stretching across the horizon. The great city stirred awake beneath the glow, but inside the study, time seemed to pause. Charles remained by the window, watching as the dawn spread its gentle light over the ancient walls. For the first time in his 75 years, he felt no shadow at his back. The truth, once his heaviest burden, had become his greatest release. The monarchy would continue, shaped now by honesty rather than silence. His sons would carry the crown forward with open hearts. And as the pale sun rose higher over Buckingham Palace, King Charles allowed himself a small, quiet smile, a smile not of victory but of freedom.